the eve of the American Revolution, the Anglican Church in America was in a privileged position. After all, it was the Church of England in America, closely aligned with the mother country, by allegiance to the king, by the prayer book, and by its oversight by the Bishop of London. And in Maryland, the church was even more privileged because it was the established church in the colony. That meant that everybody in Maryland had to pay taxes to the upkeep of the church and for the clergy because it was the official church of the colony of Maryland, just like it had been in England. So the vestry acted as an arm of the county government. They actually heard minor trials, they meted out fines. It was a little England transplanted in Maryland. Tobacco was the currency of the day, and every free white male over the age of 18 had to pay the parish 40 pounds of tobacco. And the owner of every enslaved person, male or female, over the age of 16, had to also pay the same amount to the parish. So the wealth that the Anglican Church accumulated before the Revolution and after depended on tobacco, which depended on slave labor to plant it and harvest it and make the money for the people who gave the land for most of our old established churches. There were 300 active Anglican parishes in the 13 colonies and 250 clergy, over half of whom were in Maryland and Virginia. So they had all been ordained in England because America did not ever have a bishop. And because they were ordained in England, they had to swear allegiance to the king because he was the head of the church. So the War of Independence raised all kinds of questions by the clergy and by other people about loyalty and patriotism and conscience. And of course, following the war, the Anglican Church suffered greatly, probably more than any other church in the country. In Maryland, before 1776, there were 57 Anglican clergy serving here. And after the peace of 1788, only 31 remained. Our first historiographer was the Reverend Ethan Allen, not the same Ethan Allen. He says that 6 went back to England. That's including your rector, Bennett Allen. 12 died during the war. A few moved to other states. And some, like our first bishop, Thomas Claggett, just went home and waited it out to see which way it was going to turn out. By one count, those who sided with the Tory establishment and those who were neutral, clergy in Maryland, those were evenly divided. There were very few vocal patriots, only about half that number. And you can see why. If you were ordained in England and you had vowed to uphold the Church of England and sworn allegiance to the king, it could be a very dicey situation to be in. Whatever sentiment Anglican clergy espoused during the war, their church found itself in an extremely vulnerable position after 1776. On November 3rd, 1776, while meeting in Annapolis, the Maryland legislature adopted the Declaration of Rights, which in Article 33 affirmed that no one should be compelled to contribute to a particular church. So it swept away all the taxes that the Anglican Church in Maryland used to support itself ever since 1692. we are very fortunate in Maryland because the legislature did allow the churches to keep their buildings, their land, their glebes, and everything that they owned. But in Virginia, they stripped them of everything. Thomas Jefferson was really ticked off at the Anglican Church, and they took away their land, their buildings, their glebes, they took away everything. So we were very fortunate that the legislature allowed us to at least keep what we already had. So we had our property, but we didn't have much else. We didn't have any financial support. We had no organization. We had no bishop. We had no diocese. And before the war, there were 45 parishes in Maryland, and all of them had rectors, and some had curates as well. But by 1780, only 21 had a priest, and several parishes shared one priest. So the survival of the Anglican Church in Maryland was not a given. So actually, All Saints in Frederick has a really interesting example of the precarious situation that the Anglicans in Maryland were in. So this is just before the Revolutionary War, but it's such a juicy story, I have to tell it. So on May 27, 1768, the Reverend Bennet Allen took over as rector of the parish. He followed a long and revered rectorship of the Reverend Thomas Bacon. And controversy preceded Mr. Allen wherever he went, apparently. He was a close friend of Lord Baltimore. And when he arrived in Maryland, he had a letter to the governor. Now, the governor was the person who appointed clergy to parishes. It was his prerogative. So the letter from Lord Baltimore told him to find a very wealthy parish for Allen, and if one parish couldn't support him, then he'd have to give him 2 or 3, which was against the law of Maryland, but anyway. So Allen was appointed to St. Anne's in Annapolis on January 1st, 1867. And we have Allen's correspondence with several people, and one of them said that he didn't like St. Anne's Annapolis because the income was not even enough to supply him with liquor. And he wanted a wealthier parish. So apparently he had a temper because he would challenge men to duels, and apparently he caned Walter Delaney in the street in Annapolis. But he heard that All Saints rector, poor old Thomas Bacon, had died on May 24th, 1868. And so 3 days later, Allen breezed into Frederick, presented the vestry with a letter from the governor saying, "Hi, I'm your new rector." But the vestry had heard about him and his notorious behavior, so they refused to give him the keys to the church. Allen wrote a letter to the governor after this incident that I'm going to tell you about, and it's at the Maryland Historical Society, so this is what he says. He says that somehow he got a hold of the keys on Saturday, and he went into the church, and he read some prayers, he read the 39 articles, and he read his own induction sentences. Then he heard that the vestry had taken the locks off the doors and bolted them from the inside. But on Sunday morning, he says he got up at 4 o'clock, found a ladder, got into the church through a window, opened the doors, and let the congregation in at 10 o'clock. But the vestry tried to prevent him from reading the service. And Allen says, as one man came near him, Allen pulled a pistol on him, saying he would shoot him if he didn't leave him alone. But Allen did decide he'd better flee. So he ran out of the church, but he was pelted with stones and everything else that the congregation could find. And he told the governor that he was out of Frederick, he was going to Philadelphia, and he was hiring a curate to take over. So 5 days in Frederick were enough for So he did hire a curate. He did not stay very long, however, and the Revolution drove Benedict Allen to go back to England, where he didn't stop his crazy ways. Apparently one of Delaney's relatives was in London, and they fought a duel in the street, and Allen killed him. So, I was telling this story to a clergy friend of mine. He goes, "Well, gee, we're not so bad nowadays, so the records from All Saints immediately post-Revolution seem to have been lost, but it appears that there was no vestry and no services were held at all. In 1782, the Reverend Francis Lauder apparently served for 2 years, but then he died. And then there's nearly a 30-year period when the rector of Hagerstown, who was George Bower, served in Frederick, Petersville, and Tawnytown, as well as Hagerstown. So he came to Frederick once a month. And Bishop Claggett made a list of clergy in 1798. He listed Bower as rector of Frederick, but residing in Hagerstown. So because the Anglican Church had been used to receiving taxes for their upkeep, and they didn't know what to do to raise money, because there was no tradition of people actually giving money to support the church, because it had been done by taxes. So some of them came up with the idea of a head tax, which, that didn't go very well. But what usually happened in most churches was they had pew rentals. People would rent a pew in the church for a year, and the prices varied. The ones closer to the pulpit, you'll be glad to know, were more expensive. The ones at the back of the church were cheaper, but of course some people couldn't afford anything. So there were usually a couple of rows in the back of the church for strangers or for poorer individuals who couldn't afford to rent a pew. And they were free pews in the back. So there's no records that All Saints chipped in to help pay for Mr. Bower's salary, but there had to be a group of lay people at All Saints, even though we have no record of it because your records have been lost. But they kept the church open, they cared for it, they attended worship. He came on the fourth Sunday of the month. There was no vestry, but there had to be a core of devoted people who kept the church alive during that very precarious time. So I'll give you a really good example of that in a minute, following Bishop Claggett's election. So the Declaration of Independence had put Anglican Church in a very precarious position. And now being associated with England was not a good thing. So the question evolved, what are we even going to call ourselves? Members of the Church of England were suspected of being loyalists, whether they were or not. So in 1780, 24 laymen and 3 clergy met in Chestertown on the Eastern Shore to formulate how we were going to go forward. And if that meeting is where the name, the Protestant Episcopal Church, came about. That's what they decided to call us to replace the Church of England or the Anglican Church. So Maryland has a lot of firsts in Episcopal Church history, and that meeting in Chestertown is one of them. It was the first convention held in the 13 states by Episcopalians trying to cope with the changes that had come about from the Revolution. It was the first church convention which had lay representatives as well as clergy. Most conventions before that were run by clergy, and lay people had no say. And this is where they adopted the name, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Of course, another problem was that America had no bishop, and Episcopal means bishops. So the church had to figure out a way to get a bishop. And they had to go to England to be consecrated, which was a problem. And an interesting side effect of Maryland not ever having had a bishop was that nobody had been confirmed. And in that day and age, to receive communion, you had to have been confirmed. So the clergy would hold confirmation classes and act as if the people had been confirmed, but there had not been a confirmation in Maryland ever. So the first American consecrated as a bishop was Samuel Seabury of Connecticut. You might have heard his name in Hamilton. He was definitely a loyalist. He was ordained, consecrated in 1784 in Scotland. Then William White of Pennsylvania, he was consecrated at Lambeth Palace in 1787, along with Samuel Provost of New York. And then James Madison, not the president, was consecrated for Virginia in 1790, also at Lambeth Palace. And now we come to the another first for the state of Maryland in the Episcopal Church. Thomas John Claggett was the first bishop ordained and consecrated on American soil. September 17th, 1792, at Trinity Church in New York City by the 4 American bishops. And this is his consecration certificate, which you are welcome to come and have a look at. It's got the seals of all 4 bishops. And it's quite an amazing thing that America's first bishop ordained in America is the Bishop of Maryland. So I think that's another Maryland first that we can be proud of. So the very first confirmation that Bishop Claggett ever did was at All Saints in Frederick. 6 months after his consecration, he came to Frederick and he confirmed 11 people. And his list is in the case out there of the people he confirmed. And I love it. He drew a little finger pointing at Eleanor Grosh, and he wrote in there, the first person I ever confirmed. So that's very special for you. And sometimes he had confirmation classes of 200 people because nobody had been confirmed. So the people in Frederick who remained and were the faithful remnant there, with no vestry, no rector, no money, they obviously were together enough to host the bishop on his very first confirmation service. And I think that says a lot about the people in the church in Frederick. They took care of the place, they took care of themselves, they kept it organized, they didn't let it fall into ruin, and they were together enough to host the bishop on his very first confirmation service. So you could probably look at yourselves today and find that same remnant of people who you can always count on. There are always a few who do about 10 jobs. But the fact that the church was held together by the laity, not by the clergy, says a lot about the faith of the people in Frederick and in Maryland at that time. So basically, to sum up, the clergy in Maryland during the Revolution didn't do a lot. Most of them, well, half were loyalists and half were nothing. And most of them either did like Bishop Claggett and just went home and waited it out. But I think coming together after the war to figure out how we're going to survive, what can the church do to make sure that we go on? What are we going to call ourselves? How are we going to govern ourselves? How are we going to raise enough money to keep the church alive and to pay our clergy? If you think about what all they faced, it's a miracle that the church survived, actually. And it's a testament to the Holy Spirit that the church did survive in Maryland after the Revolution. So I think the people of All Saints Frederick could be justly proud that they sustained their church and had it a vital, living place for the first Bishop of Maryland to come and have his first confirmation service. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them. But
real quick, Mary, thank you very much for that presentation. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel immensely proud of All Saints.
Yeah,
wonderful legacy has continued for nearly 250 years.
Yes.
Two quick questions. One, what did Maryland and our church in particular, if it's the case, have any role in the development of the new prayer book and the Constitution, the new Constitution of the Episcopal Church?
Well, people say that the government of the United States is modeled on the Episcopal Church. Two separate houses, you got the bishops and you got the clergy and you got the lay representatives. I think when the first prayer book was made, it was a joint effort. The Episcopal Church was tiny. If you could even imagine how small it was after the Revolution. And I think the first prayer book, we have an old prayer book in the archives that was marked out about 3 times as the king changed, George III was written in. But basically they took the English prayer book and modified it to reflect the American way of life, and of course changed everything having to do with the king to the president. But it was a joint effort of the very few bishops and clergy who met, and of course Claggett was in that crew, and other clergy from Maryland. As I said, there was by no means any guarantee that the church would even exist, especially having been so closely aligned with England. So I think we could be thankful that it did. Yes?
So my question, if you could speak to sort of pre-1776, but also like as we transitioned from Church of England to the Protestant Episcopal Church, I today we tend to use the term parish interchangeably with a specific building and a specific congregation. And I'd like to understand more what that meant.
Okay.
And not only what parish meant, but who were the parishioners.
Okay. So in 1692, when the Anglican Church was established in Maryland, they carved out 30 parishes. They were geographical entities. That's what the parish was, a geographical entity, 30 throughout the whole state of Maryland, including the Eastern Shore, all the way to Western Maryland, Southern Maryland. There were 30. The parish was the geographical entity, miles long, probably, a huge space. If there was a church inside those parish bounds, that would be the parish church. If the parish was so big that the people over here couldn't get to the parish church, they might build what they called a chapel of ease, so that they were closer to a church building because they couldn't drive 35 miles in their horse and buggy to get to the parish church. So parishioners in 1692 were everybody who lived within the metes and bounds of the parish. Because that's the way it was in England. Everybody was a member of the Church of England, whether you were or not.
And that would include white landowners, indentured servants, Native Americans. If you were within that geographic band,
Yes, you were considered a parishioner, yes. Of course, today, it's kind of muddled. We tend to say that any independent church in the diocese is called a parish. Some are, some aren't, but the origins of the term were a geographical entity which owed taxes to the parish church for its upkeep and for the upkeep of its rector.
So when we had, and I think I didn't know the year, but when we had the rector or whatever he was, who was living here, had a residence in Hagerstown, but also served Tommytown and I think one other.
Yeah.
Petersville.
Yes.
That was all within the parish,
Well,
geographically?
yeah. Frederick was a huge parish when it was organized. Well, when the St. Paul's in Baltimore was the city and county of Baltimore.
The whole county.
That was the parish. So you can just think of it today, geographically, it's huge. And how do you even get to all those people, and how do people get to you? A lot of challenges there.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Other question?
Yep.
I was wondering, during the time when parishioners were only coming to church about like once a month, what other ministries were the lay people up to during that time? Were they doing things similar to how we do today? Or was there a lot of like charity work going on? I know it was a very like tumultuous time politically. What can you say about just
Well,
what they were
during
doing?
the Revolutionary time, I don't think what we think of as what church people would be doing really was going on. It did later. There are multiple examples of, especially the women in churches being who the vestry would look to if they needed money, because they were always raising money for whatever. They were doing the charity work, the Sunday schools, all that. But during this early period, that really wasn't the case. We have a Society for the Preservation of the Gospel, which sent missionaries to America. They sent a questionnaire, and the clergy answered all the questions. And some of the questions were, what are you doing for the infidels in your parish? That meant Native Americans and enslaved persons mostly. And the answer was usually, we don't do anything for the Indians because we don't speak their language. Often they would have separate classes for enslaved persons where they would teach them the basics of Christianity and the prayer book. But I think mostly it was the clergy, and as I said, the vestry served as like people on a county council. They had civic responsibilities as well as church responsibilities. So I think of what we think of as good works or came later, but at this time, I don't think that was really going on very much. I know your rector had a school for enslaved persons here in Frederick, but that was fairly rare. And I had an intern one time who looked at our confirmation records and made a chart of antebellum confirmations of African Americans. And it's a fascinating document just to look at. And most of it depended on who the clergyman was, whether he was determined to have African Americans confirmed. And All Saints Frederick was one of the ones that had more than just about anybody, especially in this area. So we do have the names of those people who were confirmed from All Saints, which would be a fascinating project for somebody to look at.
That's true.
Was there a question? Yeah.
When church life back then, with the horse buggy and we get around,
Yep.
few vicars and very few churches.
Yeah.
Did you have an equivalent of Eucharistic visitors or that kind of thing at that time? So when someone dies or someone needs sickness?
Well, the priest was all they had, and the priest definitely went to homes where a parishioner was ill or dying and would take communion, would baptize an infant in extremis or something like that. There are many instances when the clergy would ride out to an outlying place because a parishioner was dying. So that did happen, but it was all the clergymen who did that kind of thing. Lay people were not involved, like a lay Eucharistic visitor that we have today. That was not a thing back then. So if the clergyman couldn't get there, it just didn't happen.
Do you have any idea or any speculation, what happened to our records for that period after?
When I was looking up the information on this, all I found was the records were lost. And I don't know what that means. Often it's a fire, but sometimes the parish register and the vestry minute book would end up under somebody's bed because it was just a church building. So the senior warden would take it home. And then when he died, the kids threw it in the trash because they didn't know what it was. So that's happened way too many times. But I think mostly fire and just disappearance are the main factors we've lost the early parish registers or the early vestry minutes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you.
You're such a resource for us. I wondered if you could speak more to the Reverend Thomas Bacon and his book about sermons.
Yes, he's a fascinating character. We have a lot about Thomas Bacon at the archives, so you'll have to come down and do some research. But he wrote about masters and slaves and how masters should treat their enslaved persons and how slaves should react. It's a fascinating book, and it's, of course, of the time, but just the fact that he was interested enough in educating enslaved persons and educating the masters as to how to treat them says a lot about him. And as I said, he had a school. He's a fascinating character, and someone I'm sure your parish archives have a lot about. It would, I mean, just to do a study on Thomas Bacon would be a great thing to do. There's plenty of information about him, and you know, All Saints Frederick has a lot of those firsts too. So, yeah. Well, thank you all.
Yes,
Oh,
this
we
thing-
got another one.
Oh,
I just, quickie, so you said that they met in Chestertown
Yes.
to decide what to do as far as the church organization. Was that just for the church, the Protestant Episcopal Church in Maryland?
Yes.
Or did they have people from the other colonies?
Just Maryland.
Okay.
Yeah. And as you saw, there were more lay people than clergy. I think there were 24 laymen and 3 clergy. So that in itself is a huge breakaway from how the Church of England ran. To have lay people in Maryland, such as the people of the vestry, were so used to governing themselves that it was just a natural thing to say, well, we're not going to be left out. You know, we've been governing ourselves for a couple hundred years here. You know, we've been in charge. We've held this place together, and it's time for lay people to have their say in the church. And that was a precedent for the whole Episcopal Church after that lay people were always included in the doings of the church, and every general convention, there are lay people, clergy, and bishops. So I think we can be justly proud of steering. I think that meeting steered the church in the whole of the United States toward that kind of governing.